Why you should read The Assassination of Julius Caesar by Michael Parenti. If you, like me, grew up in the United States, chances are a significant portion of your history classes growing up were devoted to three things: the US, ancient Greece, and the Roman Republic and Empire. You probably remember being taught about the invention of democracy, in whose names countless lives have fought and died for, and how a single power-hungry man by the name of Julius Caesar destroyed a republic. How, in order to save the republic, a conspiracy of senators, at the signal, withdrew the daggers concealed beneath their togas and stabbed Caesar to death. Why removing Caesar from the picture, the alleged source of the problem, failed to stop the republic from turning into an empire shortly afterwards, was never clearly explained. But perhaps that was just a matter of me not fully grasping the finer points of the tumultuous civil war that succeeded Caesar's assassination. There is something, however, that was never addressed. What republic were the assassins declaring to save? For their republic, the republic of the super-rich, was not the same republic as that of the ordinary Roman people. In The Assassination of Julius Caesar, Michael Parenti turns everything you were taught about Rome on its head. When we pause before we take the word of assassins, we see that Caesar did indeed pose a very serious threat, just not one that you are usually told, to the privileged interests of the super-rich. With this context, Caesar's assassination is not an anomaly, but one in a long line of political murders that bloodied the better part of a century. Reformers who campaigned, with popular support, for a more equal distribution of wealth and more democratic rights for the people, who were killed by death squads of the super-rich, and, in the end, in the case of Caesar, at the hands of the super-rich themselves. Julius Caesar, the man, viewed in isolation, is not the focus of Michael Parenti's book, but rather what his assassination shows about how, in the eyes of the super-rich, even the whisper, let alone the action, of even the tiniest of redistributions of wealth is a threat that must be crushed at all costs. Michael Parenti begins by deconstructing the narrative of Roman history as we've been told. As the saying goes, history is written by the victors. But what is also true is that history oftentimes is written by the wealthy. From the renowned senator and orator Cicero and other contemporary Romans whose names have been ingrained in our collective consciousness, to the 18th century British historian Edward Gibbon, with his magnum opus, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, to the present, the perspective of Rome from the eyes of the multimillionaires that ran it has been perpetuated by largely wealthy, upper-class historians. Those historians side with their own class, condoning the oligarchy's prerogatives and decrying any attempt by the lower class at social change. And so, the Roman people are a rabble swayed by bread and circuses, and the senators assassinated Caesar out of the goodness of their own hearts and their love for the Republic. This is what we are told, and we are supposed to accept it unquestioningly. Michael Parenti searches for the voices of the common people in the silence between the overpowering, self-righteous orations of those with money and power justifying their money and power. He listens for them in the snippets of popular movements that are ridiculed and discredited as nothing more than tools for demagogues, consigned not even to second thought, and even, and very often, slandered as threats to democracy. Rome was a society that ran on slavery. Out of the entire population of Italy, for every 2 people you met, a third would be a slave. Slaves were people from conquered lands, victims of kidnapping, or the children of slaves themselves. They were individuals convicted of capital crimes, those who were destitute and unable to repay their debts, or children sold off by their impoverished families. They were war captives who were worked to death in mines and quarries, or on the plantations known as latifundia, at such a rate that their numbers were always dropping. A Roman slave could be flogged, branded, mutilated, starved, or crucified, with no right to self-defense. While it was possible to buy freedom, few slaves could dream of ever scraping together enough. Slaves were sexually exploited on a pandemic scale. Runaways were hunted down by professional slave catchers, fugitivari. Roman law required the torture of slaves to extract evidence, from men and women alike. If a slave murdered their master, then every slave in the household would be executed. Against a slave, everything is permitted. The famous Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote. While Seneca did bitterly criticize the cruel treatment of slaves, he made use of servi himself. And the ordinary free Roman lived from hand to mouth, doubled or tripled up in inner city tenements, rampant with typhoid, typhus, and fires. Building codes would not appear for another few centuries. All without toilets, running water, and decent ventilation. These tenements were owned by wealthy speculators who were indifferent to their collapse, which happened all too frequently, or burning to the ground, because it was cheaper to patch up old cracked walls or put up another equally unstable building in its ashes than to construct something structurally sound. 2 of my shops have collapsed, Cicero wrote to a friend about his tenement properties, and the others are showing cracks, so that even the mice have moved elsewhere, to say nothing of the tenants. Other people call this a disaster. I don't call it even a nuisance. There is a building scheme underway, which will turn this loss into a source of profit. Some of the hardest labor fell on the shoulders of ordinary Roman women. They were laundresses, domestic servants, millers, weavers, spinners, and even construction workers, on top of their daily household chores. But even when women shared the same occupations as men, they were barred from joining craft guilds. Throughout much of Roman history, women were not given individual names. That's why from the male Claudius, Julius, and Lucretius, you would get Claudia, Julia, and Lucretia. Sisters all shared the same name. The only way they were distinguished from one another was by tacking on the elder, or the younger, or the first, or the second. So Gaius Octavius's daughters were Octavia the elder and Octavia the younger. Women died younger than men from malnourishment, mistreatment, exhaustion, and childbirth. They lived under the rule of a male figure and were swapped to secure fortunes or forge political alliances. Almost half of Roman brides were under the age of 14. Many were married at as young as 12. A husband who engaged in sexual liaisons was free to do so, and it was common practice. A wife who did so, or who was alleged of being unfaithful, could be killed by her husband. Above the slaves and propertyless freemen, or proletari, were the small farmers, who owned just enough land to qualify for military service, and just above them were minor officials, merchants, and industrial employers. This slim middle class lived in apartments outside the stench and noise of the inner city, but within manageable distance of the forum and baths. Democratic reforms were not handed down from above by magnanimous oligarchs, but on the contrary, won despite their vehement opposition. Less than 20 years after Rome expelled its kings, its people began their struggle to win the right to popular elections and legislative assemblage. It lasted more than 200 years. Commoners demonstrated and rioted. When called upon to serve as soldiers, they engaged in highly organized strike actions, otherwise known as secessions. The tribunate of the people, the closest thing Rome had to a popular democratic office, was created only after years of popular agitation and threats of armed secession. Ordinary citizens, assuming there was space left in the open-air venues where assemblies were held, could only vote yea or nay on proposals submitted by a magistrate and could not amend any clause. The centurial assembly, or comitia centuriata, which elected consuls and praetors, conducted voting in block units around traditional military groupings that were heavily rigged towards the propertied classes. The most power lay in the hands of the Senate and the several hundred men of wealthy background who controlled it. Inequalities existed within the Senate itself. Monopolies of power were guaranteed by its inner circle of nobles and the influence they exerted over the election of major magistrates. Despite all this, ordinary working-class Romans, immigrants, and slaves could sometimes rattle the system. As Michael Parenti writes, with enough unity and mass mobilization, poor city dwellers, in alliance with votes from outlying districts, might pass measures that were opposed by the dominant aristocratic faction in the Senate. That was the Republic of the ordinary Roman people. But what was the Republic of Caesar's assassins? By one magistrate's estimates, the late Republic was ruled by no more than 2,000 super-rich families. Though conflicts would occasionally arise between the slightly lower equites, or equestrians, and, at the apex of the social pyramid, the aristocratic oligarchy of the nobilitas. Among their differences, wealth, land, slaves, trade, and finance was not one of them. Both groups of this multi-millionaire elite lived in sumptuous mansions on estates, of which many owned multiple, the size of townships. They indulged in gourmet meals served on plates of silver and gold, had game preserves and aviaries, stables housing the finest horses, private baths. Senators paid no taxes. The money they lent the state was paid back to them with interest from funds that came from taxing less privileged populations at home and abroad. As Michael Parenti writes, in Rome's late republic, as in any plutocracy, it was a disgrace to be poor and an honor to be rich. The rich, who lived parasitically off the labor of others, were hailed as men of quality and worth, while the impecunious, who struggled along on the paltry earnings of their own hard labor, were considered vulgar and deficient. Where did all this wealth come from? From the majority of the population upon whose backs the empire had been constructed, and the people whose lands the empire had devoured. One example that exposes the wealthy's rapaciousness and parasitic nature is the theft of the ager publicus. For generations, collectives of smallholders, in exchange for a modest rent to the state treasury, farmed the ager publicus, the publicly owned fertile lands to the south and east of Rome. These collectives, run by free labor, produced enough to support the entire city. To protect smallholders, legislation was passed. Under law, no individual could hold more than 500 agera, roughly 310 acres, of land. For a while, this helped the poor and kept the greed of the rich at bay. But that Rome could be fed by the common farmers, with not a penny of profit extracted by the rich, was more than the rich were willing to tolerate. Using fictitious names, wealthy men succeeded in transferring most of the public land to themselves, then, finally, took possession of them openly, in their own names. By the 2nd century BC, using a combination of opportunistic buyouts and outright violence, the wealthy had seized the ager publicus and turned it into their own estates. In time, the laws were changed. Unlimited concentration of public and private lands in the hands of the wealthy was now legal. Rome was a republic for the few, and its multimillionaires intended to keep it that way. By the 2nd century BC, the Senate nobles had started to split into two groups. On the one hand were the populares, reformers who sided with the people, or, in the words of their rivals that are repeated to this day, self-aggrandizing demagogues who violated the Constitution by encroaching on the Senate's power. On the other hand, were the Optimates, the self-fashioned best men, and, as described by Cicero, the foremost men and saviors of the state. Stripped of romantic euphemisms, the Optimates were defenders of the politico-economic prerogatives of the super-rich. The Senate was dominated by Optimates. Michael Parenti challenges the mainstream views of the popular reformers of the last century of the Roman Republic by looking at what really were their crimes. Tiberius Gracchus had his finger on the pulse of inequality in not just Rome, but Italy as a whole. An aristocrat elected as tribune in 133 BC, Tiberius Gracchus mobilized people inside and outside the city to pass the Lex Agraria, a law that put a cap on the amount of public land a single individual could own, as had been the case before. Surplus land would be redistributed to the poor. Tiberius Gracchus's law was not extreme in the least. The wealthy individuals who could have been punished for their land grab crimes would only need to surrender their illegal holdings. The land would be bought back from them at market price. The wealthy would be paid for the land they'd stolen. Tiberius Gracchus's law would have given thousands of families a chance to work the land. Rome would have become less congested, and the depopulation of the Italian countryside would have been reversed as opportunities people had moved to find in the city appeared outside it. Tiberius Gracchus proposed other reforms. He wanted to reduce the age of military service, give the people the right to appeal jury verdicts, allow equestrians to sit on juries that had previously been composed entirely of senators. Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, one of the greatest orators Rome ever produced, followed. Upon being elected tribune, he set out on a comprehensive reform program: redistribute public lands, construct roads in the more fertile districts to advance Italian agriculture, make it possible for plebs to buy grain at a lower price. He made enlistment terms shorter and gave free clothing to soldiers. He sought to grant Italian allies the same voting rights as Romans, lives as citizens instead of subjects. He broke the Senate's monopoly of serving as jurors in criminal cases and introduced a bill barring any magistrate deposed by the people from ever holding office again. While serving as tribune, Lucius Appius Saturninus proposed a law to distribute affordable grain to the working class that could hear cases of debasing the majesty of the state, which meant that Optimates were now fair game. Another reform-minded senator, Gaius Servilius Glaucia, joined him. Marcus Livius Drusus wanted to extend voting rights to large portions of Italy, distribute corn at subsidized prices, replicate the land allotments proposed by the Gracchi, and compromise on reforming the law courts. Gaius Marius, Caesar's uncle by marriage, had no clear political reform policy. However, he gained popularity for having waived property qualifications for military service, enlisting soldiers no matter how poor they were, mainly due to the fact that there weren't many property-owning farmers left. Allied with Saturninus and Glaucia, he pushed for land for his army veterans and subsidized grain sales, then broke and joined Lucius Cornelius Cinna in storming Rome to kill hundreds of aristocrats and their collaborators. One of Julius Caesar's first acts upon assuming the office of consul was to have the proceedings of the Senate and the Assembly publicly posted daily, which made both bodies more accountable to the citizenry. Instead of seeking to kill his political enemies after defeating them, he sought to work together with them. He filled government posts with his own men, his slaves, freedmen, and followers of humble birth, appointed centurions, soldiers, scribes, and even a small number of sons of liberated slaves to the ranks of the Senate. He gave indebted free Roman citizens the right to surrender their estates to a creditor, whether it covered the amount they owed or not, and not their personal freedom. Under traditional Roman law, the worst sentence a wealthy individual could receive for murdering another citizen was exile. Caesar added another punishment, the seizure of their property, which, as Michael Parenti explains, for the opulent class, a fate almost more frightening than death itself. But the corollary principle of each of these reforms, no matter how minor, was this: the rich would have to surrender a fraction of their astronomical wealth. The oligarchs were ruthless against anyone who threatened even a modicum of their wealth. Tiberius Gracchus was smeared as a demagogue and a tyrant who was set on crowning himself king. When the tribal assembly gathered to vote on Tiberius's re-election, one of the largest owners of public land, Publius Nasica, along with other senators, descended with a large gang of hired thugs and slaughtered Tiberius alongside around 300 of his supporters. Neither Tiberius nor his supporters had taken up arms. Gaius Gracchus's courteousness and eloquence made it much more difficult to pin the slander of demagogue and violent on him. The Senate passed what would later be called the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a decree that allowed for the suspension of Republican rights in defense of the Republic. One must admire the Orwellian phraseology here. The Senatus Consultum Ultimum gave magistrates the license to absolutist power, political repression, and mass murder. The Optimates sicked their death squads on Gaius Gracchus and 250 of his supporters, as well as fellow populares, massacring them all before proceeding to execute an additional 3,000 Democrats. The other popular reformers met similar ends. The Senate declared Senatus Consultum Ultimum again in 100 BC. Lucius Apelles Saturninus and Glaucia were placed under custody. An Optimate death squad broke through the roof of the Senate House and murdered them. No prosecutions followed. Marcus Livius Drusus was stabbed to death in 91 BC, assassin never looked for. For the crime of attempting to continue Drusus's reforms, his friend, Sulpicius Rufus, was hunted down by the Optimates death squad and killed. Rome's history is strewn with bodies, even those of its own people. Caesar was not the first to violate the constitutional prohibition against bringing armies within city limits. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was the first to cross that Rubicon. After all, the Senate's beloved constitution could be suspended when its wealth was at stake. In 88 BC, Sulla marched his forces into Rome. In 87, his death squad slaughtered thousands of unarmed citizens and wealthy followers of Cinna. Their crime? Wanting to revive Sulpicius Rufus's egalitarian reforms and a more democratic voting system in the tribal assembly. A few years of foreign campaigning later, Sulla returned for a political purge. Up to 10,000 people were slaughtered. When Quintus Sertorius, who, among other reforms, advocated for citizenship for the people of the Iberian Peninsula, he was hunted down and assassinated. And we all know how things ended for Caesar. Like all other leading Romans, Gaius Julius Caesar was a slaveholder. He used slaves and women for personal pleasure. Under his command, Roman forces killed, uprooted, enslaved, bereaved, and made destitute tens of thousands of Gauls. Whether Julius Caesar was truly committed to the cause of the people, or was merely using their support for his own gain, is still unclear. However, as Michael Parenti points out, when seeking wealth and power, joining the Optimates would have been the much easier and much more logical path. And when Caesar declined a decision that would have turned public opinion against him, the population made sure their approval was heard. In my opinion, what makes the assassination of Julius Caesar stand out is Michael Parenti's unflinching look into the darkness of empire and at the motives of people who benefit from it, not the excuses you are given. He peels back the rhetoric around these events to look at the violent and dark truth they reveal. The wealthy will stop at nothing, not even the mass murder of innocent people, to keep even the smallest modicum of their wealth from leaving their clutches. But what I also take away from it is this. When we understand that we have been pumped full of narratives that try to smooth over empire's so-called rougher edges and justify the existence of an elite class of the super-rich who amass that wealth through crime and are perfectly content for people to die for it to continue to grow, then we can look at things through our own eyes. Michael Parenti said of the ruling class, "The only thing they care about you is what you're thinking." The Assassination of Julius Caesar asks us to think for ourselves. Thanks for watching this video. Like I mentioned earlier, this video was inspired by The Assassination of Julius Caesar by Michael Parenti. But there is a lot more information in the book that I didn't get a chance to cover, like how religious augury was used as a tool for social control, political witch hunts, and the full set of reforms instituted by Caesar, which went over extremely well with ordinary Roman people, but not so much with the ruling class, to put it lightly. If you're interested in not just the late Republic, but what's going on in our own times, you can't miss Dr. Parenti's book. A lot of time goes into researching and creating videos like these. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more work like this, please consider subscribing. It goes a long way to supporting this channel. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.